Hi guys, it's Oopsie here. Today I'll be introducing 3 hand building techniques to get you started sculpting with clay. So our first cup was made using the coiling method. Then this one was made using the slab method. This one used the pinch pot technique. And lastly, this big one I did a combination of all 3 techniques. So let's get started. Let's start with the coiling method. I like to squash my clay into a coil shape before I begin rolling. The important part is to create this long, thin coil as evenly as you can. Also, you can spray your coil or your surface area with water to keep it moist and prevent cracking. Before starting, it's easiest to have an idea of the form and shape of the object you want to build. I'm just making cups, so I begin by creating the foundation of my cup by spiraling my coil. And you can choose to keep the coil texture, but for me, I'm going to smooth it out and blend it so that you don't see that coil texture. And also you can use whatever tool is at your disposal, including your fingers. For beginners, it's hard to gauge whether your clay is too dry, so to ensure that your clay sticks together and doesn't crack down the line, you can score the clay, which is what I'm doing here. You're slashing the clay, but not too deep, just the surface, and then you add slip to it. You do this with both objects you're attaching, and the slip essentially acts like glue, and you just want to add pressure as you are attaching both objects so that they successfully stick together. All I'm doing now is using my fingers and tools to blend out the coil, and also I'm using the straight edge of my knife tool to help shape my cup. Also make sure to smooth out the inside as well, because if your cup is to hold liquid, you want to make sure that there are no cracks that water can go through. I'm also flattening out my cup's rim so I can score and place my next coil much easier. So then I just repeat the process where I make a new coil, score, add my slip, and then attach my coil to my cup. That is slowly forming. Oh, I forgot to mention, slip is simply a mixture of clay and water. You can easily make it using preferably bone dry clay, which means the clay is completely dry, and dropping it into water. The consistency can vary depending on the ratio, but the less water, the thicker the slip. Another thing to note is because of the constant use of slip, it can make your object super hydrated, making it really hard to work with eventually. So once it reaches that point, you could set it aside so that it can dry and stiffen up. To make a cup using the slab method, take a wooden roller and begin to roll the clay out to form a thin sheet. This is our slab. There are slab roller machines out there that can definitely make your life easier, but for those of us without the money, we can just use a roller. But make sure it's wooden, because clay has a tendency to stick onto sleek surfaces like plastic, so wood is the best for its porous element. I also take this metal rib to compress my slab. So I'm using my coil cup as reference and tracing around it to make the shape for my slab cup. So now I'm making a new slab for the actual circumference of this cup. Also, air bubble. Normally I just stab it and then I go on my day. Air bubbles form when you don't wedge your clay properly. Honestly, I haven't been throughout this video, but that's okay. You can just stab it and then use your little metal rib here to compress it, and sometimes you can pop them. Anyways, for this step, you can definitely use a template, but for me, I'm just going for it. I'm cutting the sides and hoping to make as even of a rectangle as I possibly can. The slab I made was a bit short, so we're definitely not gonna have the same circumference of the circle that we traced, but that's okay. For slabs, it is really important to score because slabs tend to dry quicker due to their thinness. Definitely score and slip. If you find the slip to be getting in your way, just make sure to scrape off any excess slip to make your life easier. And just like what we did in the coiling method, make sure to smooth out the inside of the cup and also anywhere you had a connection with new clay. Slabs can be a bit more finicky because they can dry faster, but also they're extremely hard to work with if they're too wet. So if you ever need to put it aside, please do so. For the pinch pot technique, I get my ball of clay and I just stab my thumb into the center of this sphere and I just start pinching essentially. It's pinching and pulling at the same time. You're sculpting your shape as best as you can, but you're working the bottom of the clay to the rim The beginning of this stage, your brim will be quite thick, which is what you want. Also, make sure you are rotating your object as you pinch and pull so that you are working the whole body, not just one part. You might notice that the rim is very uneven, but don't worry about it. We'll fix that later. The pinch pot technique is very much a trust the process kind of process. It's very intuitive, so you just gotta keep going. It will eventually come together, but the process can look very chaotic. You can also use the straight edge of your tools or even bring out a ruler to help guide the shape of your cup. So here I am trying to define the shape of my cup because it's a little lopsided right now. So I'm trying to straighten it up as much as I can. But she's still a little thick, so I'm also trying to redistribute my clay as much as I can. The process is very back and forth with the pinching and then the reshaping of the clay. And then once you get the shape that you want, you can finally start to clean it up a bit, like how I am scraping off any excess clay now and then cleaning up the surface of the cup as well. Whenever I'm making something using the pinch pot method, my goal is to make my piece as evenly and thin as possible so that my cup, for example, is not too heavy and it's comfortable enough to hold after it's been fired. But honestly, don't worry about that. Just worry about creating something and having fun. I'll also be setting this pinch pot aside to let it stiffen up a little bit while I work on our last cup. So I'll be utilizing all the techniques I just showed to create this cup. I'm starting out by making a slab to make the foundation of my cup. Remember to compress your slab using that metal rib. I plan on using coils to build up my cup, and I'm also using my coils as a tracing reference. So, of course, I am making sure to slip and score throughout this process. I definitely did not think about the size when I attached this coil, but that's okay. Also, like a good way to know that you have a good connection with the two objects you're attaching together is if you see the slip kind of pop out in between the seam. Anyway, I'm repeating the same process from the coiling method where I'm just making my coil, slip and scoring and attaching that coil. The only thing I'm going to be doing differently in a minute is when I start pinching. Also, I no longer need this extra amount of clay, so I'm just trimming it off and cleaning it up. So I'm blending out my coils as well as much as I can before I move on to my next coil layer. Here it's kind of hard to tell, but I am pinching upwards to kind of spread out the clay a bit more. I'm also trimming the rim down since it's uneven and a bit jagged, and this helps me for when I make my next layer. And I'm going to continue coiling here by slip and scoring and adding a new coil. It's also hard to tell here, but I am pinching downwards into the clay. Then I go through and smooth down that coil, make it look nice and pretty before I move on to my next coil, which here I am completely pinching this coil onto the last coil I laid down. I'm pinching downward and also upwards. Then I go through and smooth it all out. And now I'm just simply trying to clean it up as best as I can and also reshape it into the cup shape that I want. So I'm just using all my tools here. That rim is really jagged though, so I am going through with my X-Acto knife and just cleaning it off. As I finish up, I'm evening out the surface area of the cup before I move on. And finally, I am now going back through all my other cups. Since now they're all kind of stiffened up, I can go through and fix them up and shape them to my heart's desire. The main thing I'm doing though is cleaning up the rims, the surface areas as much as possible. Also making like a cute little indent for the foot of the cup. You definitely want to add a 45-degree angle to the foot of your cup. Otherwise, it's likely to chip whenever you set it down. So that's just something to keep in mind. So now you'll know 3 hand building techniques, and I hope that this video was useful for you guys. And lastly, here are the 4 cups we made today. As usual, thank you guys so much for watching, and if you want, follow for more.